The sergeant's affair was an incident that took place in Mandate Palestine in July 1947 during Jewish insurgency in Palestine, in which the Jewish underground group Irgun kidnapped two British Army Intelligence Corps NCOs, Sergeant Clifford Martin and Sergeant Mervyn Paice, and threatened to kill them if the death sentences passed on three Irgun militants, Avshalom Haviv, Meir Nakar, and Yaakov Weiss, were carried out. The three had been captured by the British during the Acre Prison break, tried, and convicted on charges of illegal possession of arms, and with intent to kill or cause other harm to a large number of people. When the three men were executed by hanging, the Irgun killed the two sergeants and hung the booby-trapped bodies in a eucalyptus grove near Netanya. This act was widely condemned in both Palestine and the UK. After hearing of the deaths, some British troops and policemen attacked Jews in Tel Aviv, killing 5 and injuring others. The killings also sparked off rioting in some British cities. Background: in the late 1940s, as the third decade of British mandate over Palestine was drawing to a close, many within and outside of Britain were calling to end the mandate. They were led by opposition leader Winston Churchill, who denounced Britain's costly occupation of Palestine for no economic benefit, trying to maintain control and civil order. The British enacted the Defence Emergency Regulations in September 1945. These regulations suspended habeas corpus and established military courts. They prescribed the death penalty for various offences, including carrying weapons or ammunition illegally and membership in an organisation whose members commit these offences. As World War II ended, a Jewish insurgency began, with the Zionist groups Irgun and Lehi attacking British targets in order to compel the British to leave Palestine. The insurgency was a response to Britain's implementation of the White Paper of 1939, which greatly restricted Jewish immigration and land purchases. The British authorities began applying the death penalty against captured Jewish militants, while the first member of a Jewish underground group, Shlomo ben Yosef, was executed in 1938 for his part in an unsuccessful shooting attack on Arab civilians who were traveling on a bus. No further executions of Jews for politically motivated violence were held in Palestine until the late 1940s. During an Irgun attack on a British military base, Irgun fighters Michael Ashbel and Yosef Simchon were arrested. They were sentenced to death on June 13, 1946. There were many pleas and petitions for clemency by various institutes and Jewish leaders, which were not effective. Irgun decided to threaten to carry out its own gallows regime, declaring a policy of reprisal killings. 5 days later, Irgun kidnapped 5 British officers in Tel Aviv, and another one the following day in Jerusalem. The Irgun then threatened to hang its hostages if Ashbel and Simchoni were executed. 2 weeks later, following intense and secret negotiations, Ashbel and Simchon's sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. The officers were released the next day. In January 1947, another Irgun militant, Dov Gruner, was sentenced to death for shooting and placing explosives with intent to kill during an Irgun raid on a Palestine police force station in Ramat Gan in April 1946. On January 26, 2 days before Gruner's scheduled execution, Irgun kidnapped a British intelligence officer in Jerusalem. The next day, on January 27, Irgun men also kidnapped a British judge, Ralph Wyndham, who was president of the Tel Aviv District Court. 16 hours before the scheduled execution, the British Forces commander announced an indefinite delay of the sentence, and Irgun Irgun released its hostages. Meanwhile in Britain, Churchill, now the leader of the opposition, demanded a special meeting on the subject, and on January 31, a 4-hour discussion in the British Parliament took place, with Churchill demanding the suppression of the terrorists in Palestine. On April 16, 1947, Gruner and 3 other Irgun militants, Yehiel Dresner, Mordecai Al-Kahi and Eliezer Kashani, who were caught during the night of the beatings, were executed. 5 days later, 2 other prisoners, Meir Feinstein of Irgun and Moshe Barazani of Lehi, were scheduled to be hanged for, respectively, the bombing of a Jerusalem railway station in which a policeman was killed and the attempted assassination of a senior British officer. However, a few hours before they were due to be executed, they committed suicide using an improvised grenade smuggled to them by their colleagues. Irgun commander Menahem Begin was enraged by the executions, and ordered his men to abduct and hang British soldiers in retaliation. However, the British Army, well aware of possible retaliation, took precautions. As Begin would later recall, "Our units went out on the roads, onto the streets in the towns. But the military were literally not to be found." May 4, 1947 saw the Acre Prison break. The Irgun engineered a mass escape from Acre Prison, with the aim of freeing 41 Irgun and Lehi prisoners. Some 28 Jews and almost 200 Arabs managed to escape. However, 9 Jewish fighters were killed. Among the perpetrators of the prison break, 3 were killed and 5 were arrested, while 2 of those arrested, Amnon Michaelov and Nagman Zitterbaum, were minors, and thus too young to be executed under British law. The other 3, Avshalom Haviv, Yaakov Weiss and Meir Nakar, were not. The Irgun High Command had no doubt that they would be tried and convicted of capital offences, and the Irgun immediately set out to find British hostages. All of the arrested Irgun militants refused to accept British judicial authority. However, they were tried by a military court, and Haviv, Weiss, and Nakar were sentenced to death. In an attempt to forestall the likely death sentences, the Irgun kidnapped 2 British military policemen, a sergeant and a private, out of swimming pool in Ramat Gan on June 9. However, the attempt to use them as hostages failed, as 19 hours later British troops found the hiding place and rescued them. 2 days later, the 3 Irgun militants were sentenced to death. All that was needed for the sentences to be carried out was approval from the Commander-in-Chief. Irgun resumed, with increased urgency, its kidnapping attempts, which proved difficult due to British precautions against abductions. British soldiers were largely confined to heavily guarded security zones that had been established throughout Palestine, and standing orders required troops to move around in groups of at least 4. Matters were further complicated by Lehi's actions in retaliation to the killing of one of the members, Alexander Rubowitz, who was allegedly murdered in captivity by Major Roy Farran. Lehi decided to carry out revenge attacks, and the Irgun was concerned over the fact that it would be even more difficult to find hostages if Lehi began gun battles in the streets. Lehi agreed to hold off its attacks for a week, and Irgun carried out 2 unsuccessful abduction attempts. The first, on June 22, saw Assistant Superintendent of Police C.J.C. Pound escape from his would-be captors in Jerusalem. On June 25, an abduction squad in Jerusalem attempted to seize Administrative Officer Alan Major and hit him on the head with a hammer, but Major managed to struggle free. After the week passed, Lehi carried out 2 attacks in Tel Aviv and Haifa which killed 2 British soldiers and wounded 5. These attacks resulted in even tighter security precautions. UNSCOP visited the region and an appeal was made to the committee to intervene on the convicted men's behalf. On July 2, an appeal by UNSCOP on behalf of the condemned men was rejected, and on on July 8, 3 weeks after the sentences were passed. They were confirmed by the commander. Due to the concurrent visit of UNSCOP, the executions were postponed. This delay, intended not to anger the committee, gave the Irgun extra time to accomplish the kidnapping of hostages. Kidnapping. Several weeks earlier, Irgun had learned about a Jewish refugee from Vienna named Aaron Weinberg, who had fled to Palestine and was working as a clerk at a British military resort camp in North Netanya. This information was already known to the local Shai commander, Yehoshua Barziv. Weinberg, who was a Shai agent, was entrusted by Barziv with striking up a relationship with two sergeants from the British Army Intelligence Corps, Clifford Martin and Mervyn Paice, who used to spend a lot of time in the camp. The sergeants were of interest to Shai since they belonged to the field security unit and worked with the Tulkarm police, which was in charge of the Sharon district. The mission was to circulate within the local population and pick up information on the Irgun and Levy and the supporters. They often operated in civilian clothes and were not subject to standing orders intended to prevent abduction attempts. Notably, they did not have to leave camp in groups of 4, and sometimes went unarmed. Weinberg was very successful in his task, and occasionally got the sergeants to go out to the Netanya beach. On one of those visits, on the night of Saturday, July 4th, they were noted by an Irgun member sitting in the Ganverd Cafe, who heard them speaking English and who followed them back to the camp. Based on his information, a week later Irgun made arrangements to kidnap them in the hope that they would return to the cafe. On July 11, 1947, a group of Irgun men retrieved weapons, chloroform cloths and ropes from a hidden cache. After the recent failures, the Irgun militants in Netanya were skeptical regarding the chances of this kidnapping attempt. Because of this, they did not go to any great lengths to cover the tracks, considering the complicated operation they were planning. They did not steal or borrow a vehicle or bring in non-local members who were less likely to be recognized. Furthermore, Yosef Meller, a long-time Netanya resident and newly recruited Irgun member, volunteered to use his black taxi cab, which was well known around town, for the kidnapping. The abduction operation was led by Benjamin Kaplan, who had been freed in the Acre Prison break. At nightfall, one basic precaution was taken: the taxi's license plates were changed in an attempt to prevent it being recognized in the course of the abduction. That evening, Weinberg and the intended victims showed up once more at the cafe. Martin and Paice were in civilian clothes, were unarmed, were outside the camp at hours typically forbidden for British soldiers to be outside camp, and were not part of a group of 4. After being informed that his intended victims were there, Kaplan posted his men around the coffee shop and along the road leading north to the camp and waited for an opportunity to perform the abduction. Weinberg and the two sergeants did not leave the coffee shop until after midnight. The two sergeants had decided to walk Weinberg home before returning to camp. Meller's cab, with Kaplan and 3 others inside, started after them. It pulled over and the 4 men emerged, masked and holding guns, and assaulted their targets. After resistance by one of the sergeants, they were forced into the car and Meller drove off. Weinberg was left under guard in an orchard in North Netanya, from where he was later taken to another orchard and released. The hostages were taken to the inactive Feldman diamond polishing plant in the industrial area on the south side of Netanya, and were held in a specially built underground chamber that had been built in the plant's cellar. It was sealed with an aluminum-ringed airtight hatch that was hidden by a thick layer of sand, and there were sandbags under the hatch to prevent any hollow sound if it were tapped. Inside was a canvas bucket, a week's supply of food and 2 cylinders of oxygen which the sergeants were instructed to use to refresh the air in the cell. Every few days while they were there, the bucket was emptied and the food restocked. The search for Paice and Martin Weinberg remained in the orchard until daybreak, and was found by a watchman at 5:30 a.m. He reported the kidnapping to the British Army. Shortly afterwards he was interviewed by the Palestine police force, and gave them the details of what had happened. Reports of the kidnapping also reached the Haganah in Netanya. Oved Ben-Ami, head of the Netanya Council, called an emergency council meeting. He did not invite the revisionist party members, who were identified with Irgun. The decision was made in accordance with the Yeshuv's position, which was published the next day, calling the kidnapping a provocation that might jeopardize what hope was left for clemency for those condemned to death. It pleaded for every decent civilian to assist in the search for the hostages. Meanwhile, Haganah set out to find and release the kidnapped men, by force if necessary. Until the time period, the Haganah had avoided collaboration with the British authorities since the end of the Caesar, and on occasion, it had mounted anti-British operations and collaborated with the Irgun and Leti. However, in the summer of 1947, it began trying to sabotage Irgun and Leti operations as part of the Little Caesar, due to the fact that UNSCOP was present in Palestine at the time. As a result, it assisted in the search. The Shai commander in the region arrived in order to personally oversee the search. Unlike the British, the Haganah was familiar with the area, and knew every potential hideout within a 10-mile radius. Despite this, it found no trace of the hostages. Searches by the Jewish Settlement Police and the Palestine Police's Criminal Investigations Department were also fruitless. Yehoshua Bar-Ziv, who had resigned as Shai commander in Netanya in the meantime, provided his successor with information about a recently built underground bunker under the house of Irgun member Haim Binai in Ramat Yomkin. They were convinced that this was where the hostages were kept, and passed that information to Haganah. All the while, Ben-Ami was desperately trying to pacify the British authorities and promised them that Yeshuv would do anything to find the hostages. However, after his conversation with Netanya Council members of the revisionist party, he published an announcement in a newspaper saying that he had been told by Irgun that the hostages would not be returned until the condemned Irgun members' fate was made clear. Subsequently, the British Army placed a cordon around Netanya and the surrounding area of Amek, which had 20 outlying settlements, a total area of 15,000 people, and on July 13 began an extensive search effort, codenamed Operation Tiger, to find the sergeants. The area was placed under martial law as 5,000 British troops conducted searches and questioned residents. A total of 1,427 people were interrogated during the operation. Local residents were kept under curfew, and Netanya became a virtual ghost town. Its streets were empty save for patrolling British soldiers and armored vehicles. At this point, Haganah believed that they had accurate information on the location of the hostages. The information made it all the way up to the Haganah Chief of Staff, Yisrael Galilee, who passed it on to the Haganah High Commander and Chairman of the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion. Although the Haganah, acting under the Jewish Agency direction, had at times cooperated with the Irgun and Leti and carried out anti-British operations, it was at the time conducting the Little Caesar against the two groups, attempting to suppress their activities by foiling some of their operations. Galilee, who was opposed to any collaboration with the British, had ordered preparations for a forced release by the Haganah. Ben-Gurion thought that a forced release, no matter by whom, would lead to the hanging of the condemned in Acre, and Irgun's finger would be pointed at the agency, Haganah and Shai. He therefore made two decisions. First, the hostages were to be released by force, but not by Haganah, as Galilee suggested, but by the British. Second, the information regarding the location of the hostages was to be passed anonymously not only to the British, but to Ben-Ami as well. By doing this, he hoped to give the impression that Ben-Ami had passed the information to the British. Ben-Gurion was relying on this. Plus, Ben-Ami's call to the Netanya residents to leave no stone unturned to attract reprisals from Irgun if the hostages were rescued. On July 17, British MPs Richard Crossman and Maurice Edelman appealed for the release of the sergeants, as did other public figures and private citizens in Britain. The father of Mervyn, Paice, wrote a letter to Menahem Begin asking him to spare his son's life. The letter was sent to Palestine addressed to the commander of the Irgun. In Palestine, a postal worker who was a member of the Irgun ensured it found its way to Begin, who in an open radio broadcast on Koltige and Halo Kemet responded, "You must appeal to your government that thirsts for oil and blood." Leak of information to Irgun. Ben-Gurion's plan didn't work. In the course of a meeting with revisionist party member Yaakov Weiss, Ben-Ami told him that Haganah knew the kidnapped soldiers were being imprisoned under Bernai's house. Weiss, who knew the information was wrong, passed it to Avraham Asaf, the Irgun's district commander in the Netanya area. Asaf knew the hostages were not in Bernai's cellar, but it did contain the equipment used in the kidnapping, and he thought its discovery might assist the British in finding the kidnappers of the hostages. He therefore arranged to have the evidence removed. The next day, during the extension given by the British to the Yishuv for the Haganah to conduct its own search, the residents of Netanya were placed under curfew. The British, acting on the information from Haganah, decided to search Benai's house. In the late afternoon, the neighborhood was surrounded by military vehicles, including tanks and armored cars. Benai and his neighbors were arrested as searches began. However, as the equipment had already been removed, nothing was found. All the while the hostages were kept in the polishing plant. They had been drugged with chloroform during their abduction, and when they came to, Kaplan told them they had been taken hostage. On the advice of Amichai Paglan, the Irgun's chief of operations, who arrived from Tel Aviv on the day of the kidnapping, a decoy was arranged. A pickup truck was loaded with kidnapping equipment and sent to Herzliya, where it was left at the beach, leaving clear traces. Paglan also arranged for oxygen tanks to be brought to the bunker before returning to Tel Aviv. Near discovery of hostages by police, the diamond polishing plant where the hostages were being held was searched twice by the British, but both searchers failed to turn up the hostages. A few hours after Paglan's departure, an incident took place that could have led to the discovery of the hostages. The two lookouts at the plant noticed a police car patrolling the area. Fearing it was heading towards the plant, they hid themselves. The police car was on routine patrol and went on its way, but the guard in the nearby plant noticed them slipping through the window, assumed they were burglars, and called the police. On an ordinary day the police might not have taken his report seriously, but this time a strong force was sent to investigate, accompanied by a plainclothes officer. They conducted a search of the plant. However, one of the plant's owners, who did not know about Irgun's unauthorized use of his property, naively convinced them there was nothing in that to concern them. Having found nothing, the policeman left the scene. The plant was searched a second time by a British patrol. As the soldiers pushed open the doors, an Irgun guard inside heard them and escaped through a back window. The soldiers heard him and conducted a painstaking search of the plant, but failed to find the hatch.